Good morning, everyone. My name is Eleanor. I'm a staff attorney working at the Center for International Environmental Law. I'm currently in Paris, a few minutes away from the building, but due to a technical issue on UNEP's website, I unfortunately did not manage to register and have a badge, so I cannot be today in the room with you. It was also not possible due to technical restrictions to do this online, so I'm very thankful that co-organizers have allowed me to present through this video today and for working so hard on the logistics of this event. Today I will talk to you a little bit about trade provisions and the Plastics Treaty. And I will start by mentioning that to end plastic pollution, the treaty will need to effectively address plastic production, including through production bans, prohibitions, or restrictions. This is very important because science has shown that simply recycling will not work, in part because production is still going up and because there are huge health and environmental impacts linked to plastic recycling. Many states have actually mentioned the need to go upstream in their submission and to address production of products as well. And actually, it appears in 5 out of 12 of the core obligations proposed by UNEP in its options paper. So what does this has to do with trade and trade measures? So regarding the transboundary movement of plastics, we know that besides plastic waste, plastic feedstocks, precursors, additive, primary forms of plastics, for example, resin pellets of fibers, and products that also contain plastics are not only largely produced, but they are also largely traded, meaning imported and exported. The control measures at the upstream level and midstream level will require also to include some trade mentions to address the import and exports of those targeted products and materials. And why? In part because we need to ensure that the treaty is coherent. So, for example, if the treaty doesn't allow for a product to be or a material to be used or produced or to be used in products, we should also not be able to import and export those products or materials that have been restricted or controlled under the treaty. Additionally, it's also very important because we will need also to ensure that, for example, we put measures of control at the border and harmonize this type of measures internationally, in part because many states might not be plastic producers, but they might be importers of products that have plastics. And so for that reason, it will be very important to ensure that what comes to their countries is also in alignment with the Plastics Treaty. So addressing plastics trade in the treaty is extremely important. We will also need to close legal gaps and ensure some form of harmonization. We know that, and there's been some research that has been published by the WTO Secretariat and IISD as well, that demonstrates that there has been a lot of measures regarding the reduction of plastic products at the international trade level, or also that restricts the international trade of specific products with the aim of addressing plastic pollution. But at the same time, states might be targeting different products, they might put different criterias, and so we have a great legal fragmentation from this perspective. So ensuring that this goes into the treaty will close gaps and ensure some harmonization at the international level. Very importantly, we have many examples. It would not be the first time that a treaty would address the international trade of specific products, specifically international environmental agreements. There's many international environmental agreements that address trade bans, trade restrictions, for example, so prohibitions or conditions. So we have many examples that we can work on and see what is the most effective for the Plastics Treaty. For example, we have the Montreal Protocol, the Mercury Convention, CITES, the Basel Convention, and many more. So we're not starting from scratch, and we have produced at CIAL a brief, 4 or 5 pages brief that actually looks at how other MEAs have looked into trade provisions. So if it's useful, I recommend you to have a look. It is also very important to recall that WTO rules are no impediment to those type of provisions in the treaty. WTO rules have sufficient scope to accommodate trade-related measures pursuant to a MEA, Multilateral Environmental Agreement, as actually, as of today, trade measures of a MEA have never been challenged by another state at the WTO. So this is very important to demonstrate that there should be, in practice, also no problem. And there's even a GATT report from 1991, which actually mentions that it is very important for MEAs to include trade provisions in order to harmonize rules and avoid that there later on there's discrimination or arbitrary measures that are applied at the domestic level. So if we address this in a MEA, we're also ensuring, as I was saying, a form of harmonization, looking that the treaty is non-discriminatory, it demonstrates that it's not arbitrary, and this is very important for implementation later on. We have also produced a document with IUCN about this, so I also recommend you to have a look if this is helpful and if you have any questions about WTO rules and the Plastics Treaty. Additionally, many states have mentioned the need to include trade in the Plastics Treaty in different forms and at different levels. And UNEP's document mentions trade of plastics and trade provisions at the upstream level, midstream level, and downstream level. I will give you an example and just a comment. So, for example, there's the mention to have a ban, limit, or reduction of the manufacture and export and import of virgin plastic polymers. This is very important. It demonstrates this need of harmonization. It's not only about addressing the production and the use, but also the trade of those same products that are being targeted in that specific core obligation. So very important. And additionally, there are other mentions of having trade requirements for specific products. Requirement is still a bit of a vague term, so we will need to look at this more closely later on the zero draft, and to ensure that actually it's not only about addressing trade requirements, but it's actually about mirroring the specific type of measure that we are applying on the use and production of a specific, for example, material or product. So if we are, again, not being allowed to produce it and use it, so then we should also prohibit the import and export. In this sense is what I'm mentioning, the mirroring. So it's not only about putting requirements, it's about mirroring provisions later on in the core obligations. Very importantly, also, many states have mentioned the need to include non-party trade provisions in the treaty. This is extremely important. It has also been mentioned quite extensively in UNEP's document. We also produced a document at CL in order to clarify any legal question regarding non-party trade provisions, and I will give you some information about that. So why do we have non-party trade provisions in MEAs? But first, it's very common, again, to have this type of provisions in other treaties. So it's like in the Basel Convention, there is non-party trade provisions, Montreal Protocol as well, CITES. Many of those treaties have non-party trade provisions, and they generally answer the following questions. How to, for example, create incentives for non-parties to join the treaty. How to ensure that the import of products from non-parties states comply with the treaty, and how to prevent non-parties from benefiting, for example, from not being parties to the treaty or enjoying environmental gains achieved through other parties' commitment, but actually not making the efforts themselves. So for this reason, states have implemented non-party trade provisions in the operative parts of treaties in the past, in other MEAs, because trade bans or restrictions with non-parties prevent parties from circumventing treaty obligations through import and export with non-parties, incentivizing non-parties to implement the treaty regime in practice. Meaning, it's not actually putting obligations on non-parties, but it's actually ensuring that parties' obligations are not, like, parties will not only apply those obligations of the treaty between themselves, but they also are obliged to apply the same obligations on the import and export of products between them and with non-parties, so to ensure that, for example, third parties, non-parties, are not allowed to export products, so import for those that are parties, specific products that are not in alignment with the treaty. So in a certain form, we extend the obligations of things that are applicable between parties, but also between parties and non-parties. Regarding alternatives and substitutes, this is very important because once we know what we want to avoid. Trade can also help promote alternatives and substitutes to plastics and also needed technologies. And UNEP's option documents mention this in core obligation number 8. It also recalls the need to put definitions, a definition on what an alternative and substitute is, because today there's no international agreed definition of a substitute or alternative to plastic. It also proposed to have an annex list with criteria to determine what is an alternative and substitute, and also mentions the need to have technical assistance and research. It is very important to recall that alternatives and substitutes also will need to be based on a science-based approach, meaning that we will need to have scientists that provide specific information to ensure that alternatives and substitutes to plastics are actually non-toxic, they are safe, they have no risks for health, and we're not just changing plastics for something that is actually still not good for the environment or for health, and we replicate problems that plastics have in the first place. It's also important to remember that from an international law perspective, we will need to apply also the precautionary principle, which dictates that the adoption of a caution approach in matters related to the environment when there is scientific uncertainty about possible negative impacts. So if we are not sure basically that something is non-toxic and it's safe, it should not go into the market. It's also important to remind the principle of self-sufficiency, which requires that most waste should be treated or disposed in the state where it is produced. So whatever we're creating as alternative and substitutes, we should be able to manage within the country where this is produced and used. And also the principle of prevention and the no harm principle. There are many resources that are useful for everything related to trade and plastics in the context of the Plastics Treaty, research from UNCTAD. We have produced also some papers. There's a lot of documents produced by the WTO Secretariat, tests, etc. So I invite you to have a look and do not hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions during the week on the questions on trade and plastics. I'm in Paris, so really do not hesitate for that. Thank you very much, and I hope you're enjoying this event. Thank you.